Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to chat about a fascinating topic that I've been delving a little more into, trying to figure out what's going on with all of the men in the world. And we're going to be chatting with Ian Zapcic today and his study, An Alpha Wouldn't Spare an Emotion for a Woman, a directed qualitative analysis of dark triad outcomes in women's relationships with red pill men. Now, there's a lot of words probably even in that sentence that people aren't going to understand, and we'll get into that in a second. But first, want to introduce our guest here, and I was excited to have him on today. And he is Dr. Ian Zapcic, is a social worker who studies how the identities and worldviews formed in online-mediated communication spaces and how those identities interact with other spaces or the offline world. Ian grew up in New Jersey, where he received his bachelor's in contemporary arts from Ramapo College and his master's of social work from Rutgers University. Ian received his Ph.D. from the Ohio State University College of Social Work in 2023 and is currently an assistant professor in the MSW program at Stockton University in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right. I just came back from a conference last month of matchmakers, dating coaches, love experts, etc. About 100 of us. And it's so fun to be in a place where you get to just talk shop about kind of what's going on. And I was really honestly surprised. These are the people that are in the know, if you will, about what's going on about within relationships and human interactions and emotional intelligence. And when I brought up how men were in this bit of a crisis right now, I had so many people just clueless, being like, "Well, what do you mean? Like, what's going on? What crisis?" It was like, or like, "What's going on?" Like, whew, okay, where do we start? Um, and so, can you give us at least a quick basic overview of what the study is and what you were looking for, and then we'll delve into it a little bit deeper.
Sure. So as you mentioned in the little intro there, there's a lot of table setting that has to happen to be able to talk about this study. So I want to talk about some just big concepts real quick, for yourself and for your listeners. So number one, my study was looking at the red pill group. Now, I want to be very clear as I talk about my study throughout this conversation. The term red pill, which for those of you who don't know, comes from something from the Matrix, right? Neo is offered the red pill or the blue pill. The blue pill, he stays asleep. The red pill, he wakes up to the way the world really is. So the term being red pilled or taking the red pill is relatively common, at least on the internet now, to describe waking up. When I talk about the red pill in this study, I'm actually talking about a specific community that exists in some capacity still. Its heyday was actually a few years ago, but I am a little bit interested to see that I do think things are swinging back a certain direction. So I will see, I am interested in looking into if there's any growth or resurgence there. But they're a seduction group. They're an outgrowth of pickup artistry. It's people who use certain techniques to try to, primarily men, to try to get women to date them, sleep with them, be intimate with them in whatever capacity that looks like for them, right? The red pill is very open about their use of deception, and they're very open about their belief that a traditionally, what we would say in the academic literature is a hegemonically masculine man, right? An alpha male is the ideal presentation of masculinity and the ideal presentation of manhood, and that women want that, right? And that feminism is an obstacle to that. So that's them. And they openly advocate using manipulation or really about any type of tactics to get what they want, so to speak, right? And they were primarily organized online, especially on Reddit. They were very, very active on Reddit. And so that's the red pill. So when I talk about the red pill, I'm not talking about the whole phenomenon of being red pilled necessarily, although that is part of it. It's all kind of a similar ideology in the sense of having been woken up. But this was a very specific type of seduction group. on the internet. So that's part one. Then part two is the Dark Triad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the Dark Triad is a cluster of three personality constructs. And those constructs are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, right? And it's really important to note that the Dark Triad, there's also literature. It's growing to also include sadism, but there's still, I didn't include that because generally just speaking, it's still a growing thing. Is it Dark Triad or Dark Tetrad? That's not necessarily super important. But those three constructs, narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, they are subclinical. And what that means from a technical term is just that you can't be diagnosed with anything by having the levels that people with notable Dark Triad is. And the comparison I think that might be apt is like, for instance, if you wear glasses or contact lenses, right? I wear contact lenses. I don't meet the clinical criteria of legal blindness, but there is still a difference in my ability to see compared to yours, compared to other people's, that may have an impact on my life. And depending on how I behave, may have an impact on the lives of other people, right? So subclinical doesn't meet the criteria to be diagnosed with a specific disorder, but can still have an impact.
Could you give us a quick, like, 1 or 2 sentence definition of each of those words? Or those phrases, narcissism, psychopathy, and
Sure.
Machiavellianism, just for the listeners?
Absolutely. So psychopathy is generally associated with a lack of empathy towards others, and just really not being able to understand how your behaviors and your attitudes can have an impact on others, and really just prioritizing your own wants and needs. Machiavellianism, similar. There's a lot of overlap in these constructs, which is why they're grouped together in this way. Machiavellianism is about really doing anything that you want or feel you need to in order to get what you want. And then narcissism is obviously, we think of narcissism as self-centeredness, but when we're talking about this, it's beyond just self-centeredness, and it is this portrayal as yourself in this grand way. And it's also this inability to, similar to psychopathies, not really being able to have empathy for others. With narcissism, in this way, you tend to find some amount of not just portraying yourself as grand, but also not understanding how other people don't see you in exactly the same way as you see yourself.
Yeah, a lot of and then I know we can get into it too. Like you said, it's just kind of like one area, and then you've got like the MGTOWs, and then you've got the incels, and you've got all of these other different types of darker groups out there that are I guess I'm going to jump ahead to one of the questions. Was the internet a good idea?
That's a great question, and it's something that I think about every single day of my life. So I think the internet, in my opinion, is the best thing in my life and the worst thing in my life at the same time. That's kind of the way I see it, because I can say unequivocally that I would not be where I am, and I would not know the things that I know. I would not have been able to study this stuff and been able to get the degrees that I have had I not been a kid who had access to the internet, right? My dad's a kind of a tech guy a little bit. He's, I would say, on the early adopter side. So, I was one of the first kids in my class growing up in elementary and middle school to really have an active internet presence. And it really opened a lot of doors for me. However, I also think the internet is making things a lot worse. And I think that as we go on and on, it's making critical thinking and critical media literacy really much, much more difficult. And I think that it's gonna get worse before it gets better. And there's unfortunately not really a strong imperative for the companies and the individuals who have the most control over these companies to do anything about it.
Nope, not at all. I mean, I do try to remind people, even back in like ancient Greece news, the only purpose of news is to get eyes on advertisers. Like that, the only reason that newspapers existed was to get, we're going to tell you about stuff so that we can advertise. And so when you built the information sharing on a commoditized way, it gets weird. And then also, every village had an idiot. And you were just like, oh, that's just Joseph. He lives on the fringes. Don't listen to him. And now all the idiots got together. And aside from just that, where it's like, you can have the most out there, outlying view, and it's a 1 in a million. But you have a country of 350 million people. Now you've got a 350 person group that is doing things, that gets together, that gets organized, and that gets scary. And then part of that you talk about in your study is something that I want to talk about called the online disinhibition effect. When men of a certain age were younger and they opened their mouth and said something snappy to someone, they got instant feedback in the form usually of a fist or something of the sort. And then we learn to be careful with what we say, because there are repercussions in the real world for these things. And then we get to the internet, and it just becomes, I mean, I get, like, I've been a Redditor for over like 11 years now, so I was back in there a while. So I get the inside joke, online humor to a degree, but anything that you do over and over and over again starts to creep in every type of way that you can. And it's just, there's the old saying, like, back in the old days, we used to take a guy like you out behind the shed and beat him with a rubber hose. Like, we can't do that anymore. And so there's no repercussions for any of these. Anytime that something comes out in the Star Wars universe with a person of color, it just makes me sick to my stomach how all these people just find that it's okay to just ruin people's lives. But that's neither here nor there. And it's not our job, you and I, to fix that now. But yes, I do agree it's going to get a lot worse if it gets better. I'll hope that before it gets better, but we'll see what happens. So we've talked about the Dark Triad, talked about what the red pill is, and where did the saying in your title? Well, first, I would like to take it back even one step further. And the second word in your title, the alpha, I think is such a crazy term, because even the study on wolves that supposedly these guys have gotten this data about what it means to be an alpha male is so skewed. They released a whole bunch of wolves that were single males, adolescents together, and figure out what they were going to do. And obviously the strongest one came up, but that's not how it works in real life. The wolves are in packs of families, and they protect each other. And so even this underlying concept of the alpha male is flawed. Yes. But let's just accept it for what it is. It's a shorthand that we understand what it is. But why? And this is something I get, but it's so fascinating to me. An alpha wouldn't spare emotion on a woman. What does this sentence mean to you? Like, why did you start? Why is it so important to you to list this first?
Sure. So that was a quote from one of my participants, and it was her describing the way in which her partner had presented himself. I realize there's one more piece of table setting that I forgot to do, and I apologize, which is just that my study spoke to women who had been in relationships with men who either self-identified to their partner that they were part of the red pill and this community and or ideology, or that the person realized based on what they were doing after the fact, right? I think I only had one or two participants that realized after the fact, and was mostly people who the men openly said, this is what I'm doing, right? These are the sites that I go on. These are the blogs that I read. These are the forums that I post on. This is what I'm doing. And hers, the person who is quoted in the title, hers was someone who was very open about that. And so what it means to me, an alpha wouldn't spare an emotion on a woman, is that all of my participants talked in different ways about the emotional withholding that the men that they were in relationships had gone with. And actually in red pill parlance, in their language, they have a terminology for this. It's called maintaining frame. So you create this frame, you create this outward image of yourself as a traditionally masculine alpha male. And one of these features of traditional masculinity is emotional stoicism. Now, there have been people who've tried to point out, like, hey, actual philosophical stoicism was not about like never being emotional whatsoever. It was just about a measure of austerity and self-control. I'm not a scholar on stoicism, so I can't speak beyond that. But it has been interpreted and put forward in this community as you cannot show emotion at any given time, and because the natural order of things is that there are hierarchies among men, and that men by default are in a hierarchy above women, and alpha wouldn't spare an emotion on a woman. What does that mean to me? Is he's saying this is something, number one, I wouldn't let a woman get me all worked up. I wouldn't let a woman allow me to break my frame, to not maintain my frame, because I am inherently stronger and better than a woman. Also, given how low emotion is ranked among these men, they see being emotional as a feminine trait. To say an alpha wouldn't spare an emotion on a woman it's like saying I wouldn't throw a penny to you, right? So not only is it an establishment of dominance, it's also an establishment of I wouldn't allow myself to give even the littlest bit to you.
It's so interesting how weirdly skewed some of this stuff is. Now it's taking me back to the days of like, the game and the pickup artist stuff. And I know that this is sort of the, but one of the things that I found in this, and I see again in this, is there's a slight bit of homoeroticism in it, in that it's performative for the other men as opposed to getting laid. Like in the game, they'd go out in Vegas and they talk, and then they talk about how many numbers that they could come back and convene at their house and talk about what they were doing and how many numbers they got, instead of going and sleeping with the women.
Yes.
But like going and sleeping with a woman, that would be weak, because you'd have to show like emotion, where it's stronger to show that I didn't need it and then come back. And this kind of this similar stuff, it's just so odd. I've even seen it like jokingly, but like semi-serious on Reddit too. It's like, guys, is it gay to love a woman? Like,
I was thinking
showing love is emotion, and that's gay because you're being too feminine because you're showing emotion. And I'm just like, how did we get here? And do they, in your opinion, have an idea about this? Like, what do these men, is there a way for any of these men to show emotion if they can't show it with the women that they're with? Or is it just something that they're taught to just be a rock?
So that's a really interesting thing that I also think about a lot, because I don't know the authors off the top of my head, and I wish I did. I was trying to find this yesterday in preparation for this conversation. There was a study that was done. So there's this perception that men are less emotional than women, right? And we can have some data to back that up, that if you do like certain tests of emotional intelligence, or you look at certain relationship dynamics, like that's validated. I'm not doubting that. But if you look at how men perceive themselves, it's quite different than what the data in those things about evaluating says. And so, and I bring that up because there was one study, again, that I had read a little ways back, that essentially said that when you ask men about being vulnerable and who they're vulnerable with, they identify that they are vulnerable with other men. They see the conversations that they have, in whatever ways that they have those conversations, in whatever form they take, they see that as being vulnerable and expressing emotion. And so that to me is a really interesting phenomenon, because in answer to your question, I think that they would probably characterize themselves as reasonably emotional. I think that they would characterize themselves all as the appropriate level of emotional, right? Because obviously this maintaining frame thing, they have to have a certain, whatever your definition of the a right amount of a man to be emotional is, that's what I am, because I'm the right type of man, right? So there's that element of it. But then I think about this, as you described it, homoeroticism, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I just think about how much of this community, and like the game, which is a book that has influenced a lot of my trajectory over the last 20 years or so, when thinking about this is really how I developed into the researcher that I am currently, and would like to continue being. I just think about, I think these guys think that this is a form of connection, and that this is a way that they are being emotional with one another, again, at an appropriate amount. Or maybe they don't characterize it like that, and they say they see emotion as anathema. But either way, it is, I think, when we think about like group identity, and we think about the way people interact, there is a bonding experience that's happening here, for better or for worse.
Yep.
There is a bonding experience that's happening, and there are certain rituals, right? And some of the language in talking about how the red pill community and its structures evolved out of pickup artistry. If someone were to pick up the book The Game right now, which was published in 2005, 2006, something like that. If someone were to read The Game right now and were to then go on Reddit and go through posts related to the stuff that people talk about in the red pill, there's differences, but some of the stuff rating women on a scale of 1 to 10 based on their looks. And now obviously that predates The Game, but that's something that they continue to do. I don't know that they necessarily use the term negging. I haven't really seen that a lot in the red pill. Something that I have seen is there's something that's also mentioned in The Game and Pickup Artistry called the shit test, which is something where a woman is essentially challenging you. There's certain ways The Game talked about in using responses to that, whereas maintaining frame is the way that red pill alphas respond to that. Just certain other things, field reports, that's a big one. Talking about going out and hitting on women and what your success is and what you could have done better, and then coming back to the group and being like, here's what I did, here's how well I did or didn't do it. Field reports, that is all taken straight from the pickup artistry model. And so there are certain things where if you, like I said, read that book and then were to go on Reddit and look at the red pill, you'd see some similarities, you'd see the outgrowths, you'd see the connections. And so again, there's identities that have been built here, and there's a group cohesion. We know also from group identity work that having a language, having terminology that you can use, and having a...
You're an in-group. You're part of an in-group.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. And I talk about in-group, out-group stuff all the time, is that if I can talk to you in the way that sounds authentic to what this in-group says, then I will more easily earn my place, and I have the protection of the group.
And then this cycles back to the whole loneliness epidemic. Mm-hmm. That, like, if, obviously oversimplifying things here, but if men weren't so lonely, they may find bonding in other ways that weren't misogynistic. But, you know, now, and then that gets us into the Andrew Tate areas of the internet, and that being told that you are special is powerful. Mm-hmm. And it's a freaking calling card of cults. However, if everyone is telling you that you're the problem, and one group is telling you it's not your fault, I can see the temptation to start walking down that road, mm-hmm. to start figuring out, because like many things, it doesn't start off with barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. It starts off with be confident, women like men that speak their mind, and, you know, but then things get skewed. I had an article in defense of shy girls, you know, mm-hmm. like why men like shy girls. It got picked up in Indonesia, mm-hmm. translated and switched to, this is why men want you to be quiet. Ooh. It's like, yeah, that's not exactly what I was going for on that. So let's just talk about some more of the study.
Sure.
What were some of so in the study? We had a total of 6 participants, which obviously one would hope an N of 31 or something like that too. But
Sure.
when you're getting into, it's harder with data
Mm-hmm.
distribution to do the emotional stuff when it's not as quantitative as other
Yes.
things too. Plus, like you had mentioned, in a lot of it is self-selecting, because you're going to find these people that then trying to come out of it and find because you found these people on a subreddit called the Blue Pill.
That's correct.
Which is a way to get unraveled basically from the red pill and have a discussions about it as well too. So obviously, and you mentioned as well too, there's no real data on this from the men's side, because if it's how you talk about your feelings, these men probably don't feel they're doing anything wrong. And
Correct.
so it's hard to get all of this data. How would you go about trying to get more data like this?
So that's also something that I've thought about. So I want to make explicitly clear, because you're absolutely right, it is a small sample size. It was a fully qualitative study. Now, this data set that I used here for this article was the same data set that I had used with 2 collaborators. I have another article that's a little bit easier to access, actually, because it's not paywalled, and it's in the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma. That one starts with another quote as well. That is, "How can I love you if you won't let me do this to you?" And that one is just more general findings about the outcomes in these relationships. And so this one was taking that same data and looking at it through this dark triad lens, because importantly, I kind of forgot to mention earlier, importantly, the red pill advocates these things. We talked about what narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism are. The red pill specifically says, here's the dark triad. Use this. You will get more women. Women will be more attractive to you if you employ this in your attempts to seduce them, right? So I was looking at the data through that lens. Now, I want to also be very clear regarding my study that I'm not, again, diagnosing anybody. I'm not saying that people definitely have I'm not saying that people definitely were using dark triad, or at least knowingly using dark triad on these participants. What I was saying with the study is we have data about what dark triad relationships look like. And now, as a result of the data that I and my collaborators collected in 2019 and 20, we have a small amount, but nonetheless data about what it's like being in relationships with red pill men. And I just basically, so that's what a directed content analysis is I took the information we have about these dark triad relationships, and I was like, is that coming in this data, right? Is there a connection? Does it seem similar or not? And my stance is that, based on this paper, there's a lot of overall similarities here. So what would I do next? Honestly, I would love to continue looking at doing something maybe a bit more quantitative in terms of, can we find a broader sample of people who've been in relationships with red pill men? I would potentially like to talk to red pill men as well. It's a little bit, it's something that you have to be careful about. And I think that goes both directions. I would want to be respectful of their ideology in as much as they deserve to be treated as people.
Yeah.
But I would also, require respect and safety as well. The other thing that is something that hopefully is getting off the ground kind of soon is that as a result of this research that I've done, this study that we're talking about that I published over the summer, the other one previously that I published in 2023, I've had some people reach out, and I have a collaborator who is someone who identified himself as an ex-red pill user, and he's very interested in the quote unquote de-radicalization process. And he's very interested in looking at, kind of reflecting on his own journey and looking at the journey of other people that have been involved in this and for whatever reason have burned out. And so now I come from social work. So for me, any research that is working towards some form of practical solution, something we can turn into either an intervention or something that can at least be categorized and structured such that we understand it better, and you can do something with this information, and it can be used to help ease the lives of people who are going through things. That's kind of always where our heads are at as social work researchers. So something like looking at de-radicalization and thinking, are there ways we can figure out certain keys that, if presented at these critical juncture points, could slow the radicalization process or potentially reverse it? That would be wonderful. I'm not the only person, obviously, in the world to ever think in those terms. Psychology, sociology, social work, a lot of people have been doing this work for a long time. But what's different now, number one, is the internet, as we were talking about a little bit before. And what's different now, too, is that these types of things, these seduction communities, these radical socio-political ideologies that are couched in some form of socially palatable ideas, right? People want connections. You were talking about loneliness before. People want to be in relationships. So if you see something that says, this is going to help you be in a relationship and help you feel better about yourself, help you look better, help you act better, it's going to draw people into it. And then there's something that's also called information laundering. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but basically it's how you put the icing on the surface, and then, the cake underneath, the real content of it is the bad stuff, is the stuff that can be harmful to others. And I think, just wrapping up my response here, I had seen something years ago, and this was well before my PhD, and it was something that really, I never was interested in red pill ideology, like for something to follow, but I was fascinated by it. And what red pill always says is we're a self-help group. At the end of the day, we're a self-help group. The first thing when a person says, my girlfriend broke up with me and I heard about this red pill thing and I was thinking about getting involved, the first thing they always tell you is start lifting weights, right? Lift weights, dress better, and then do the other stuff. So it's
which is not bad.
It's not bad advice. I completely agree with you. And so, and I bring this up because they use that to sort of to kind of shield themselves from criticism and say, well, we're just a self-help group. And I saw a really great thing at one point, a really great criticism where someone pointed out, okay, but if you take all of the self-help that's not unique to red pill, if you take all the stuff that you could find in any self-help book, be more confident, dress better, take care of your body, be around people who make you feel good about yourself, try to be more outgoing, that's in every self-help book in the entire section of Barnes and Noble or Amazon or wherever you're looking. So then you strip that away, right? You do the math problem where you cancel out. What are you left with? And then what you're left with is the misogyny. When you're left with is the manipulation. What you're left with is ultimately a frame of mind that puts women lower. And, depending on how you want to look at it, I'm comfortable using the word that hates women or at least denigrates women. Not everyone would say, we don't hate women. Why would I hate women if I'm trying to sleep with them? So I don't know if I want to get into that argument, but nonetheless,
I feel like there's definitely a resentment.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Actually, that might be it. That's probably, let's take hate off the table and say resentment, I think is a stronger way to put it. And so, so if you take away the stuff that anyone, regardless of their ideology, is going to tell you, then what you're left with is the resentment towards women.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I see this in my coaching as well, too. Not to as much a degree, because usually if people find me, they're in a journey of self-help and not in a spiral. But it still leaks into everything because, again, oversimplifying, overgeneralizing things. But I have men that sit down and ask their female friends or girls are interested in, what are you looking for in a guy? And the answers they hear are someone funny and kind, sense of humor, dresses nice, likes animals, because they're answering logically, kind of because they're sitting down thinking about a list. And then these same guys see them jump on the back of a Harley Davidson motorcycle and take off. And it gets extremely confusing for the individual because to them, they feel, do you not know what you need? Are you lying? Are you just a stone cold bitch? Because I tried to become everything that you just said. Not only did you not choose me, You chose someone that's 180 degrees opposite of what you told me that you were looking for. One of the favorite ones on kind of red pilly on Reddit is the Titanic woman. At the end of the day, she's dying, and instead of thinking of her family and kids and her whole life, she thinks of a homeless guy she banged for one night on a ship. Why are women like this? And it's just part of their fuel that they, go into with this. But, God, these echo chambers are something about this.
Yes.
Now, I wanted to touch on, I don't know if you have any data on this about attachment styles and this type of behavior. Is there any correlation with any specific type of attachment style that is more prone to this than another? Or is it not something that's been focused on, or it's kind of across the board?
So I don't know. I personally don't have any data on that. I don't know of anything. One of the upsides about this field of study is that it is growing. It is something that people are starting to look into. One of the very, very difficult things about it is that as researchers, we're always playing catch up, right? That the phenomenon has to exist and has to be bigger than a bread box, quote unquote, for us to care about it. And then invariably, we're playing catch up because we're like, here's how it was at this point in time.
And academically always moves very quickly.
Very much. Well, yeah, but academically, we don't always move super quickly. However, the internet moves incredibly quickly. And so even as I mentioned earlier, like the red pill's heyday was a few years ago, and there's different things now. And so it's always changing. And so something like measuring the attachment styles, I don't know if anybody is currently out there doing it. If it's not, it's a great thing, I think, to do. One of the challenges that and I think attachment style is an interesting it's an interesting phenomenon because obviously we can do certain types of survey tests, right? Like I can take a test. I've taken the attachment style test. My wife has taken the attachment style test. We've compared and contrasted.
By the way, congratulations on your wedding.
Oh,
and
thank you.
Got married under
yes.
full eclipse. Was that totality of an
That's
eclipse?
correct. My wife and I eloped under the full eclipse in Ohio this past April. Yeah. Yes, we were in the path of totality. So there were a couple places that did it. We were in Ohio. I want to say there was also like one in Arkansas, but we were one of 175 couples who either eloped or renewed their vows. It was really wonderful. We had amazing weather. It was like a week later, it was like snowing again. So it was great. You know, we had a great time. It was wonderful. But
let me ask you a personal question.
Sure.
I'm married. You're married.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the world of emotions, and so are you. How have you found researching these things affects your personal relationship, and have you found anything in your personal relationship that helps you understand some of your research?
The short answer is yes, and that's a great question. The longer answer is I was always a very emotional guy, right? I come from an arts background. Growing up, I was doing theater, I was doing music, I was doing dance. I'd get bullied and picked on for it because I was doing things, I was doing things that weren't seen as traditionally masculine. And it was, there was a lot of my life where I felt romantically and sexually invisible to a lot of other women. And when I was in college, I was in college when the game came out, and a friend gave it to me like, this is going to change your life. And he was right, but not for the right reasons. Because he was like, you should try this, essentially. And I read the book and I found some of it interesting. And I did try a couple things a couple times at bars. And it was right when the VH1 show about the pickup artist came out. So people,
the mystery method. Yes, I know.
People were already like,
no, yeah. When I was starting to do what I did, people were like, oh, like the mystery method.
So like, I remember one time like trying like one of the routines that I had seen, and this girl's like, isn't this from that VH1 show? And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, run away, you know? So, but what I remember distinctly, and the thing that really bothered me, and this is where I wanted to answer your question more specifically, the thing that really bothered me is if you read the game, if you read the mystery method, if you read any of the pickup artistry stuff, there is a term that they use for when you're not in a routine and when you're just asking about the other person as a human being and learning about her life and learning about her interests, what she does for work, her hopes and dreams, what her cat's name is, like whatever the case may be. And the term that they use for that is fluff. And the reason it's fluff is because it doesn't matter, right? Because the only thing is the objective. You are supposed to be getting her number. You're supposed to be getting her to make out with you or get in bed with you. And so when there was definitely a moment where, like I said, I would be lying if I said I didn't randomly try a couple of these things, but I was like, I don't love this idea that the things that make her unique, the things that make her an individual, the things that should make me attracted to her are considered fluff. They're considered unimportant because the objective and following the structure is the most important thing. So I kind of, that was the first thing 15, 20 years ago that made me be like, this is not for me. And then going on more and more, I found that were there times in my life that I was invisible to women? Absolutely. Did I ever have a lot of success, like meeting a woman at a bar and taking her home and having a one-night stand? Nope, that was not a thing that I was ever particularly good at. And I think at a certain point I realized that wasn't a thing that I necessarily wanted either. And what I found was when I put myself in the right environments with people who were like-minded to me and with people who were approaching dating and we're approaching not just dating, but self-improvement and finding a partner and hoping that the person that you're with is someone you can grow with. When I put myself in those situations and found people who were like-minded, I found that I was much more successful in terms of being able to go on dates and being able to find people to have romantic experiences and relationships with. Not all of them worked, but I mean, there's like a lot of relationships that I look back on and I'm like, even though this was not the right relationship for me or ultimately this other person, I still grew from it. And at the time there was still,
it
like,
might have been the right relationship for you to grow, to learn, so that you can then enter. Like, that's one of the things I try to teach some of my clients as well too, is just because you can see a relationship's got a shelf life doesn't mean that you shouldn't enter into it. Like, there are some wonderful experiences to be had along the pathway.
And I think, sorry, I think I lost you for a second.
Sorry. Yeah. My internet's not being friendly today. So was there anything in the subcategories that surprised you? Because some of the things, the subcategories, I'm just going to read through them real quick, were rapid relationship initiation and development, emphasis on sex and physical intimacy, the quality of the breakup, emotional manipulation, physical appearance of personal accomplishments, appearance of intelligence or mental superiority, long-term consistent appearance of social success, excessive internet uses or fixations. Anything in there that you thought that was unexpected to you, or does it kind of go along with where you figured that the data was leading you?
It mostly went along. The two things that I want to highlight from that is that going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier regarding who this is for, right? So much of this is for other people. It's, I need to have a beautiful woman who is having sex with me regularly, not just for my personal gratification, but I need this woman to be beautiful and sexy, and I need to have a nice car or a nice job or a nice house and be fit and to wear clothing that people think is associated with wealth or success, because I need other people, and specifically other men, to view me in this way, right? So that's one thing I wanted to highlight, is that as much as obviously there's personal gratification associated, and I don't want to downplay that, but the part of the personal gratification comes from other people validating it for you. It's not just like, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, maybe perhaps you have a beautiful woman who's sleeping with you all the time, but if the rest of the world doesn't know it, if I can't gloat, if I can't present myself in that way, then
If a
it's
tree
almost
falls in the
treated as
forest,
like exactly. That's a great way. That's a great way of putting it. So that's the one thing I wanted to highlight. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, there's a lot of, and if you read my other study as well, there's a lot of inherent contradiction in this ideology because it is done and enacted in this way that is focused on other people's opinions. And so one of the things in this particular study that felt inherently contradictory was how there's this part of being this alpha is maintaining frame, right? It's not giving into certain urges, whether those are emotional urges, whether those are anything that's going to disrupt this construction, this outward self that you're building. But we're all humans. We all have desires. Each of us has individual desires that are unique to us, and certain people like certain things more or less or different or whatever. And so what was interesting here was that was often in conflict with this need to create this this persona. And sometimes, even though they were supposed to be stoic at all times, like any like I don't know, like any closed high control ideology group, and for those of you who watch a lot of documentaries, you know what terminology I'm using here, but for any closed high control ideology group, what you find is people who say that they're going to be following the rules, but then inherently we are human and we give in to urges or we give in to desires, and there's those cracks in the foundation. And so what I found really interesting was how many people were talking about the way things were supposed to be one way and weren't. And so, for instance, I had one participant talking about how the man that she had been seeing was a lawyer and a single dad. And, he would, one time she showed up at his house and opened the door and like, what was that movie?
can you hear me again?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
I switched internet. I switched the thing because I wanted to hear like that was some good stuff, and I wanted to get back to it. And I'll just I'll edit it. Let me just start recording. Oh, we are recording still. Okay, cool. Take it back for whenever you felt it was there.
Sure. So what I was talking about was, this outward presentation of the self, but how people give into individual urges or desires and don't necessarily follow the rules. Um, one example that was given by a participant was she showed up. The man she was dating was a lawyer, and who was also a single dad, and she showed up at his house for whatever reason, and he opens the door, and I don't know that it was exactly like this, but I think of it almost like Spicoli in Fast Times at Ridgemont High when he opens the door and the plume of smoke just comes out. She said that he was smoking pot, and they live in a state where it is not legal for recreation. And so, number one, his kids were upstairs sleeping. So she's like, you're smoking pot downstairs while your kids are upstairs. And number two, because it's illegal, that's something that he could potentially lose he could be disbarred for, or at least...
Or lose his kids even.
Well, that too, absolutely. And so any number of different things that could happen. And so... she thought it was really strange in this way of like, you go to church every week and you need people to see you at church. You're a Boy Scout leader because you want to be this pillar of the community. And then you are like, let me smoke pot downstairs while my kids are upstairs. So that was and different people obviously have different opinions on drugs and cannabis as a drug in general. In my opinion, that was a relatively benign example. And I'll give another example that unfortunately is much more insidious. Again, in my opinion, people can differ in their opinions. The participant who mentioned an alpha wouldn't spare an emotion on a woman. That was said in response to he was comparing himself to other people in talking about maintaining frame. He was comparing himself to other people who would talk about things in relationships, and specifically men who were physically violent or even just emotionally abusive to women. Basically, his attitude was, if you give that emotion to a woman, you've lost control. You've lost your quote unquote frame, and a true alpha would never do that.
You need to keep the high ground, Anakin.
Exactly. And then later in their relationship, he did become physically abusive to her. And when she, I guess, in some capacity after one of these incidents, I don't think there were that many, hopefully, but maybe I'm wrong. I got the vibe that it happened a few times. And that was when she finally was able to separate herself from the relationship for good. But when he was physically abusive, I guess she called him out and was like, I thought an alpha wouldn't spare an emotion on a woman. I thought it was a beta move to be abusive to a woman. And his response was, well, I'm an alpha and I'm doing it, so now it's an alpha thing to do.
Kind of reminds me of the GOP thing. You're a good person, so whatever you do is good. Exactly. Not based on your actions, but based on because you do it, it automatically becomes it.
And that's honestly also something that's really, when you look at the whole in-group, out-group thing, that's really common in the sense that group identity becomes the thing by which actions and activities are judged rather than the supposed ideology of the group. So exactly what you were saying, not a matter of this is what alphas do, so if you do it, you're an alpha. If you don't do it, you're not an alpha. Rather, this is what alphas do. We have accepted you into the alpha club, but you do something outside the rules. Well, it's okay because you're an alpha. You have the alpha status. Therefore, instead of changing your status, we are changing the way we look at the rules of this or organization or collective.
Yeah, good times. Good times. And now, there have been at least two that I can think of off the top of my head's mass casualty incidents where the perpetrator was a self-described incel. And we've got back here, word of the day is incel. Now, can you describe what the word means? And then the people that consider themselves that, who are they?
Sure. So incel is a portmanteau of the words involuntarily celibate. It's got an interesting history that it's, currently and in its most known form associated with straight men, many of whom typically are associated with whiteness, though not exclusively. I bring that up because it was actually coined in the late 90s or early 2000s by a queer woman, which is just a fun little fact that that people get overlooked.
She's mortified now, by the way.
I know, she hates it, and it's one of those things that I find so fascinating because she was just someone who was looking for looking for connection and feeling lonely at a time when the internet was like kind of okay at that, and then it's like evolved into this whole other thing. So incels are people who generally they believe similar to red pill ideology. Incels believe that it is feminism that is preventing them from getting laid, except whereas red pill ideology says, okay, so now these are the tactics and these are the things that you have to be aware of and these are the things you have to do to circumvent or manipulate around or to overcome this feminism. Incels say that basically, and very often they refer to the certain level of nihilism that they have as black pill ideology, where they're saying, instead of taking the red pill and self-improving, we are accepting this idea that for some of us, it's just never going to happen. Sorry about that. For some of us, it's never going to happen. We are inherently just, sometimes incels will refer to themselves as subhuman, but basically they've externalized their anger. Now, another interesting thing about the development of incel community and culture on the internet that I think is worth talking about for this conversation is that the original incel, as we know it in the current form, forum or website or place to gather was a site that was called puahate.com, PUA standing for pickup artists, right? And incels were mad because pickup artistry, there's a really, really great article if you're interested in the history of this stuff. It was published in 2019 by the authors are Bradich and Bennett Weiser. It's fully available online. There's PDFs of it. It's a phenomenal article. And it's they make the argument that pickup artistry and its little brother, its child, its stepchild, whatever you want to call it, red pill is a con game, right? They're selling you a con. They're saying if you do these things, you'll get these outcomes. And like any sketchy or shady sales pitch, like the realty tapes from the 1990s, or like the pyramid schemes, if you don't get the outcomes, it's not that the system's wrong, it's that you didn't do the system correctly, right? So that's their argument, and one of the supporting evidence,
which is ironclad, basically. It's not our fault.
Pretty much, absolutely. And so when you look at one of the supporting pieces of evidence is when you look at what the original, like I said, the original incel forum and website was, it was PUA Hate. It was a place to talk about, these were guys that were trying to do the red pill pickup artist thing, trying to make themselves alphas, trying to use the game, whatever your style was, they were trying to do it and they were consistently failing. And they were starting to actually recognize that and get frustrated and say, hey, this you sold us a rotten bill of goods. This doesn't actually work for some people. Stop saying it works for everyone and that we can, have the special cheat codes at dating and sex if we do this. And what happened over time is that, and relatively speaking, not a long amount of time, what happened pretty quickly is that this frustration was able to be redirected successfully. One of the successful cons of the pickup artist and red pill groups was that they were able to deflect and redirect this hatred. And so puahate.com changed itself and rebranded as, and this is a word that I hate to use, but this is the name of the site, it rebranded as sluthate.com.
Right.
So it went from being mad at the pickup artists for not teaching them right and for having a system that doesn't work for everyone, to being like, well, it's not actually our fault, it's women's fault, it's feminism's fault, and we're going to externalize the problem onto them. And it's not, and so this nihilism that's associated with incels and this black pill ideology is this thought that's like, well, nothing that I do could ever make a difference.
This is Aesop's fables, sour grapes. If I can't get it, then it's bad. But if I could get it, then it would be great.
And what's really interesting, you mentioned two mass casualty events off the top of your head, and I don't know which ones you were specifically.
There's the van driving one in Toronto.
In Toronto, there's Elliot Rodger in California in 2014.
They have manifestos that they quoted other people's.
Yes, and there's actually a few others that with different levels. So. Different levels of casualties and notoriety,
or some that aren't self-described but would probably fell into
that's true as well. There was I was in my first semester of my Ph.D. program in Ohio, and I went down to Tallahassee, Florida.
I'm sorry.
It was my wife's cousin's wedding, and on the night of the rehearsal dinner, we were driving back to the hotel and certain roads were blocked off. There were cops everywhere, and we get back and we turn on the TV that around the block from where this rehearsal dinner was, there had been a shooting at a yoga studio. And it came out that the shooter had, incel associated ideologies. And so I'm getting all these texts from all my classmates back in Ohio being like, aren't you in Tallahassee right now? Is this happening? I'm like, this is right down the street, So these things can happen right down the street. And, I think sometimes we live in a very big country here in the United States with a lot of people, and we forget that for some people, there can be an incel shooting right down the street. And so, but anyway, being that as it may, the reason I bring that up is because there is this nihilism that's associated. And one of the things I've very dabbled at the very edges in some of my research of mass violence. And one of the things that comes up in the mass violence literature is that many of the people that commit mass casualty acts do so essentially as a form of suicidality, right? Even if they end up surviving the mass casualty event, generally it's a person who is willing to end their life and wants to make a big scene of it as they
Go out
do
with
so.
a bang.
Wants to, literally and figuratively, absolutely. And so, so that's where incel ideology can lead for some people, is that it can go so far as to think that there is absolutely no hope whatsoever, and there's nothing that can really be done. And so why care about anything? But if I'm going to end my life, I might as well end it for these warped ideological reasons. Now, that's one thing I wanted to share. And the other thing I wanted to share related is that there's a story, and I don't know his name off the top of my head, but it's sort of bothering me. He was associated with 8chan and 8kun. There's a few stories like this, but he's a notable one, associated with 8chan and 8kun, which are websites that helped popularize some of these
If
ideologies.
you've heard of 4chan, 8chan is
Exactly.
twice as bad, basically.
Pretty much. And so he was associated with and again, there's a couple stories like this. This is not the only one, but he was associated with incel ideology. He's done interviews that I've listened to about this. And then eventually, over time, he was able to get a girlfriend and get they were sexually intimate. And so when he announced this, he basically said, "I'm stepping away because I'm no longer part of this community." And he was very he was
ahead. He was high up in the community, right?
Yes, he was. And he basically said, "I am no longer an incel, so I don't belong in this space. Thank you for everything, and best of luck. And if anyone needs me and wants to contact me outside of here, I'm willing to continue
to learn
our relationship."
How to get out of this group.
Even if it was I don't necessarily know that it was that exclusively. It could have been partially that, or he's like, if you don't want to lose me as a friend, this is not my space anymore, but I am still willing to be friends with you if you need that social connection and that social support. And people were furious with him. And they were like, how could you turn? They did. And they were like, how could you turn your back on the movement?
As a traitor, you betrayed
to
us.
The group. Exactly. And he was like, this was supposed to just be a collective of people bound by the same circumstances we were in that we felt thrust upon us. At what point did it turn into something that we identified with as a characteristic that we wanted to continue? The whole point of incels, and this is something that drew me to the masculine groups in the manosphere, as it's known in a lot of conversation online. Part of it that drew me towards it, and my line of research really came from the idea that I was like, these are groups where people who are lonely, who are looking for connection, are finding it in one another in groups where they are constantly bashing each other and constantly cutting each other down, and constantly it is in a situation like red pillars, it's always, you're not good enough, you're not alpha enough, I'm better than you. And in incels, it's the same thing, but in the other direction, you're not bad enough, I'm worse than you. But it's, you're never good enough for these men's communities.
And it's so performative.
They're incredibly performative. And what fascinates me about them is that that's the type of, but it's I think, I slightly hesitate to use this word, but I do think that there's something almost addictive or compulsive about it. At a certain point, if that's your only form, or if that's your most salient form of social connection, you are going to be seeking that. And you're going to constantly, if someone, we know this not just from the studies we've done on men's communities, we know this from any type of community. We know this from fraternities and sororities. We know this from family dynamics. If a person is withholding love and affection from you, but gives you this promise that it's going to come eventually, you are going to keep seeking it, and you are going to cling tighter to those bonds because you believe that it's coming someday and that you'll just earn your way in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's some element of that that's happening in these spaces, and it just fascinates me because it's happening in this way where you are constantly being insulted. You are constantly being told you're not good enough, and you are choosing. These are communities by choice, and you are going back there again and again and trying to prove that you're the worst in a situation like the incels, and that just it's a fascinating inversion of a lot of what we know about group dynamics and personality psychology, and so that's been a reason that I've been so fascinated.
I teach my clients dating is a mix of psychology, biology, sociology, and anthropology. By definition,
100%.
basically, so is everything we do, because it's like the four tenets of humanity. But I bring it up because we have to understand what's going on underneath, so that you can then use this information, to better yourself and to understand your communities around you. Now, so we have the Jordan Petersons, the Andrew Tates, and I'll put even the Joe Rogans in there.
Sure.
What's the antithesis? Who are the antithesis? I had mentioned Richard Reeves and Josh Galloway. I don't know if you are familiar. I think most people know Richard Reeves of Boys and Men, Men and Boys book. Who is doing good work? Who has good information that young men should be listening to?
So this is a conversation that comes up a lot, as you know, and it's a great question. And it's hard to answer, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. Number one, the reason that I think it's hard to answer is because my answer is one that I think a lot of people don't want to hear sometimes, which is that women, listen to women. There are women who have been doing this work. Something that's important to note from the research that I did here is that the red pill tells you, it's kind of like if anyone out there has ever watched It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and The Dennis System. It's something I'm a big fan of that show. And The Dennis System was very much making fun of these types of ideologies. And Dennis says in that episode, if you use the Dennis System, she won't even realize how much she's in love with you. She'll be more in love with you than she ever thought was possible. And every single one of the women that I spoke to was offered voluntarily. It was not something I necessarily asked. Every single one of them was I would absolutely never be with a man who was like this again. I cannot. This hurt me for such a long period, both in the relationship and afterwards. It messed with my head. It caused me to doubt myself. I would never date someone like this again. And I would run for the hills at the first sign of it. So I bring that up because, again, there's a lot of women at the individual level or scholars, academics, journalists. There are women's voices out there who are talking about this stuff and saying, feminism is inclusive of men, and we want to be there for men as well. And we want to make your life easier too.
Getting there, just in the last 2 years, I think, just suddenly realizing a lot of oh shit, we fucked up.
Yeah, I completely agree that the outreach has not always been the best, but I think that it's also been a case of people not listening, and so that's the thing. Number one is that when that's a hard question that no one wants to hear that, and it's not necessarily the most practical answer, but listening to women is number one. Number two, I think the other reason for me it's hard, and there are men's groups out there. I did listen to some of your previous episodes. That you talked about the group that you run with dads and stuff. And I think really grassroots advocacy and that kind of stuff is great. There was a group that I was part of, and I don't know how well it's running right now, that was called Into the Dark Blue. And it was kind of similar to something that you, the way you described your group. It's a group that the guy who started it was trying to get it to pop up all over the country, and I was helping to try to run it, and we just never really got it off the ground in Columbus, where I was at the time. But it was the same thing: meet at breweries and just talk about being a man and the struggles that people deal with, and what are you dealing with coping right now, and trying to give each other positive support in a non-judgmental way, putting aside certain social and political ideologies and being let's just be there for each other in this way right now. So things like that at the grassroots level, I think, are absolutely things that need to happen. But the last thing I do want to say that makes it really hard, there are male scholars and journalists and advocates out there and activists doing this kind of work as well. But the thing that makes it hard, and that I also always bring up, is that because there is such a rejection of anything that's not seen in these very, very narrow terms of masculinity, even when you have the best case scenario, very often people don't want to listen. And so the example that I always go to is Terry Crews, right? Terry Crews was very open. He was a football player.
He's the most masculine guy that you could get.
Masculine guy. He played professional football. He's funny. He's muscular. He talks about working out. He's got all of the stuff that like you would think, and he was open. I was sexually assaulted, and here's how I processed, and here's how it impacted my life in ways that I didn't understand. And I'm not, when I say this, I want to be very clear. I'm not in any way taking away from anything that happened to Terry Crews, but his account of it is very similar to the way women have been talking about their accounts, right? I didn't know, I didn't have the tools to realize what was happening to me, and it was something that really messed with me.
And what happened to Terry Crews?
And people just tore him down, and they were like, we don't believe you, or how could you let this happen, or it's your fault. The response to Terry Crews was the same as the response to women. And so I think that does discourage a lot of people. And you know, I come from social work, so we keenly know across any type of social dynamic or determinant of health just how funding and attention is so limited and so stretched that getting the eyes on this and getting enough people, getting a critical mass of people together with enough funding to be like, or at least enough, whether that funding is monetary or at least resources in terms of space, time,
just the language that is even used.
The language.
100%. When I was in college, I was raped by a woman, as so many men, you really would talk about it, has happened. But in the UK, that can't have happened because the definition of rape is a penis inside of a vagina.
Really? I actually did not know that. I know their legal system is different. But
the UK legally a woman cannot rape a man. Just straight up by legal definitions. It's sexual assault, not rape. So why would you come forward? And I mean, so we all know, like, men come forward, they say this, they get laughed at. Oh, you know, and so, yeah, I mean, from other men as well as, and then you have a sense of women that say, I want an emotional man. He cries. You go, I don't like that. I'm going to break up with you. That guy's never going to open up ever again.
Yeah.
You know, and I think there needs to be a little bit of a reckoning coming from the women's side in that you've achieved all that you've wanted. I mean, I'm grossly oversimplifying things, and I know that's not on a true statement necessarily, but there's no more up for you. You can't date up anymore. You're the up. So what do you want? What is a good partner for you then? And that's a struggle I have with a lot of my women, is that this is not meant to be a light or joking statement, but they don't know what they want anymore. Because do you want trust? Do you want companionship? Do you want equality? Do you want compatibility? Do you want a family? Do you want a husband? Do you want a power couple? Any of these are fine. But you got to identify, you can't have them all. And you got to identify what you want. Like, for instance, I have women that have crushed the heteronormative behavior of the glass ceilings and being bosses and stuff like that, yet adamantly refuse to let go of the heteronormative behavior of dating up or equal. And these two ways to see the world can be incompatible sometimes. And there's, again, oversimplifying things. It's like, I'm not lowering my expectations versus are they realistic expectations if we look at the data, you know? And so there's no right answer to this and stuff, but I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a little bit more focus on men, because the only way to make relationships happier for women is to fix the men a bit, you know? And I think that it's starting to realize that it's not a zero-sum game, and you're not a misogynist white supremacist if you said that some men need help these days. But yeah, I think the women are also realizing, like, I saw a comedian, she was like, I'm attracted to guys, but I don't find guys attractive. Like, you're not putting the emotional work into it. You're not dressing up. You're not doing anything that's going to make me see the value in you, kind of, and if you, and then you have all the studies that we had talked about kind of previous to us chatting. When men get rejected romantically, they turn politically to the right and start getting red pillier. And I don't know how and where we can break that cycle.
I think there's a couple things that I think.
Yes. What's your solution? Let's wrap this up with what's your solution to solving love?
Solution. Oh, well, that, I mean, let's wrap this up, and I'll just give you the 10-cent solution, and we'll be done. No, what I was gonna say is that what's really difficult when you mention, like, when men get rejected, they move politically to the right, and we know that that's the case. But I think that one of the things that we need to focus on with regard to men is that men need to get better at losing and being okay with not everything is for you, right? And I, when I was talking about some of my stuff earlier, like, for me, I used to jokingly say I want every woman in the world to be in love with me, and that was an outgrowth of the fact that I felt invisible to a lot of women. But it was at a certain point, the growing up for me, and the way that doing this work, both before I was in academia and then since I've been in academia, a big growth of me was realizing how I reinforced some of that stuff in my life. There's a lot of women that I've apologized to in terms of, not that I did anything that I think was necessarily really harmful to them, especially at the level like maybe that some of my participants experienced, but just ways that I'm like, I was enacting old ways of doing things in power systems that weren't okay. I made you feel like our friendship wasn't valid because my romantic or sexual feelings took precedence, or whatever the case may be, right? So I took accountability for that. But I also realized not every woman in the world is going to be in love with me. And even if they were, they wouldn't all be, like you said, compatible with me. They wouldn't be the right fit for me. So instead of focusing on having, quantity over quality, why don't I focus on quality and making sure the connections that I make are the ones with the people that are most important, whether that's in my romantic life. And again, I'm married, and my wife is lovely, and it's the most compatible relationship I've ever been in, whether it's professionally and who I'm around professionally, whether it's personally in my friendships and social interactions. It's all of those types of things. And so I think that that's on the men's side. On the women's side, I think, and this is not just the women's side, actually, I'd say this is the everybody side, that we live in such a fast-paced attention space anymore that the inclination to throw something away, or to see something as a red flag, to see something that may be relatively benign because there are other alternatives, is really high, because we've gamified everything. We can just pull out our phones, and then there you go. Boop, boop, boop,
I had
swipe,
people
swipe,
leave
swipe.
when I used to run speed dates, leave in the middle of the speed date because they found somebody on Tinder at the next bar.
That's wild. I did run during my PhD. I ran some speed dating events for a company, and I never had that happen. But I did have some interesting things happen, and I think that even I think we also tend to have such a narrow definition of what's attractive. I don't know if you had this experience at speed dating, but I found very often that even when you'd see people like interacting in ways, you're like, oh, the body language, the conversation seems really great. And then you get both of their cards at the end of the night, and they just put the people that are the most conventionally like mainstream, what does society tell us is attractive thing. And you're like, you guys might have had a good match if you just kind of looked past like what you walked in.
The phrase that I say is, if people had common sense, I would not have a job.
Well, I mean, that is very fair. But so the thing I was going to say is that I think the throwing away and I aimed that a little bit at women, and I don't mean to aim it too much at women, because I think it's everybody, but there is that little bit of like a meme, like dump him sis, like there is a little bit of like, the first time things aren't going exactly. And to be clear, women have had a lot of experiences, many of them where they overlooked, and all my participants talked about overlooking certain things, and then it ended up going really poorly. So I don't want to take away anyone's learning from their past experience. I don't want to take anyone's positionality or their standpoint knowledge from them. But I just think that like going into things, being willing to be uncomfortable in certain situations and like learning from each other, giving people the benefit of the doubt. Some people deserve the benefit of the doubt. Some people don't based on their actions, but like coming from a place of good faith, I think is something that would benefit all of us. And the last thing I wanted to say, I almost brought this up earlier, but I kind of held it. And I do want to mention it. It's something that's talked about in the literature on the online mediated spaces that I think when you talk about like the men going further to the right when they're rejected and stuff, that this is where things happen. And this is why this is a concern and something that we need to be aware of is what's called collapsing of contexts. And that's a term that was popularized, if not entirely coined, by Dana Boyd in her 2008 dissertation talking about the affordances of networked publics, which was an interesting space to do research in then. And now, 16 years later, it's really exploded. And I think it's a frame that I tend to use a lot in my own work. She was at like the, kind of crest of the wave of social media, and we've seen it go so much further. And collapsing of context refers to this idea that when you're in certain public spaces in the real world, the offline world, I should say, because online is real, right? But when you're in the offline world, you can make decisions about what content you consume, in the sense that if I walk into a Catholic church, I understand like what this context is and generally what's going to happen there. And there might be things that align with that, and there might be some things that don't align with that. And that's going to be up to me then to decide, do I want to stay in this context or do I want to leave this context? The internet flattens that. The internet makes it, and especially now, again, I bring up that she pointed this out in 2008. This was pre-algorithmically based feeds like Instagram, like TikTok, like Twitter or X. And so there was still more decision even back then that was allowed to be made. Now the algorithms are making a lot of that content decision for us. And I bring that up because if you go into a space that you don't know is explicitly about that, and that content's going to be there because you're like, this is a general space, or this is a space where I shouldn't expect to see this kind of thing, it's going to seep in. And my big concern, when you first reached out, one of the things that you said that you wanted to talk about is what's the big takeaway? Why is this research important? And for me, it's because I think there's a lot of people who are being influenced by these types of ideologies that don't realize they are, because they're not going into red pill spaces. They're not seeking it out, but it's filtering its way through other things.
They're all over Reddit. Like no matter where you go, like you're a beta cuck hater, it's gonna.
I mean, well, that's even that joke's bit, like that term is almost cliche now, But like another example, something that I always, something that came up, it was maybe a year or two ago. I saw this on a reel on Instagram that I think had been taken from TikTok, and it was some guy. I don't know who he was. I don't know his name, but he was like, "I'm practicing rejection skills," and he went into Chipotle and asked. He asked for free extra meat because he wanted to be rejected. He was practicing rejection. If you pick up that book that's right there that you held up earlier, The Game, that is straight from the Pickup Artistry playbook. They tell you, go out and get women to reject you, get people to reject you so that you build up your thick skin and you get used to it.
Good way of doing it. I mean,
sure.
Not the way that they're saying it.
Right. I don't
not to hang your emotions on every response, basically.
Right. And I completely agree with that part of it. But this idea of I'm going to get better at rejection by asking people to reject me or putting people in situations where they're more likely to reject is something that wherever it came from was popularized by Pickup Artistry. And this was some guy not using it in those terms. And I don't know if he was young. I don't know if he knew that that's where it came from. But now he's telling it in his video, and other people might say, oh, that's interesting. And now we're 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 10 degrees away from the origin point, which
People's
is
never even heard of it, the game or whatever. Yeah.
But then they're engaging in certain behaviors that are influenced by Pickup Artistries, or they think it's a meme. I worked during my PhD, I also did a little work. I would DJ at an ice rink on Friday nights. I had this great boss, shout out to Chris from Premier Entertainment in Ohio. And he had this great contract with the local ice rinks, and kids would come up to me and ask me to play the Andrew Tate song. And I was like, I don't know what that is. And they're like, it's a meme. And this was like after he'd already been like arrested for the alleged sex trafficking. And I'm like, I don't think that's a meme, and I'm not going to play any song associated with them. You know what I mean? I just it filters through, and it loses its sense of what it was originally connected to.
Danger, a sense of, yeah.
But the people who are profiting from it, and the people whose ideologies, even if they're not financially profiting from it, but the people whose ideologies are influencing the course of dating as you deal with in your business on a day-to-day basis, they're still quote unquote profiting. Again, even if it's not financially, they are having their influence over culture, which is what they want. And so that's something that I don't know what the answer to that is, unfortunately. Again, as I said earlier, I think that the people who are most responsible or have the most ability to change that don't have a motivation to do so right now. So I hate to be
we're gonna go dark for a while. Hopefully we'll bounce back.
But that being said, I think that that's where we're at, and that's something that we all just have to be aware of, is that when we're seeing things, sometimes I know it's hard and it's time consuming, but taking the time to go back and be like, where does this thing come from, can make such a difference in terms of knowing. Like if I'm like, oh, that's an interesting idea, I've never heard of that, where does that come from? And then I find out it comes from like a really dark or odious place. I'm like, oh, don't. Well, exactly. I'm like, I don't want to go there. So that's those are my thoughts, and I wish I had a better solution. But I just I don't know. What is Bill and Ted, be radical to each other or whatever they say. Like that's kind of just treat people with respect and assume good faith, and sometimes it gets you a lot further than you would have thought.
I think when you open your arms, most people are happy to reach across and connect with you. And I think that that's another study I have, that people think that they're going to get rejected friendshiply or any otherwise, so they ignore it. But I think that we as humans need to give each other a little bit more credit and reach out a little bit more. And I'll be looking forward to seeing what new research that you've come up with, and especially the next couple of years. I don't think the men have any idea about the blowback that's sort of going to happen the next couple of years. So we'll see how that goes. Thank you very much for joining me. I feel like we could talk for hours more. So interesting, because other than self-preservation, it's the second largest driving force in our brain, mating and staying together. And so when you have all these literal steroids and hormones and culture on top of it, it just gets so irrational and crazy that it's evergreen and ever changing. So thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to speaking again.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.